Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
The Netherlands are the first side through to the quarterfinals, following a professional 3-1 win against the United States, thanks to goals by Depay, Blind and Dumfries, after Haji Wright had briefly made it interesting for the USA. The XG was fairly even, showing that Netherlands' quality of finishing made the difference. But let's take a look at the tactics used by both sides. And a lot of you have been asking what software I use for my analysis, and it's called Once Video Analyzer Pro. And it's already pretty affordable, but I've teamed up with them to give any of you who want to try it a further 10% off by using the code FMS10. So visit their website through the link in the description below if you're interested. And we'll begin with America on the ball, as it had more of it, and the Dutch looked great in defense. The Dutch weren't planning on pressing particularly high, as they know America are great at exploiting end-to-end games, and going ahead early helped their game plan of sitting off. So the centre-backs for the USA tended to have the space to push higher up initially, with the full-backs also joining them. And the way Netherlands' front two defended was quite interesting. Rather than looking to press the centre-backs man-to-man or protecting the centre, they instead looked to position themselves often in these situations, where their main goal was to cut out the route from the centre-back to the full-back. Initially, when the game was even, the forwards would then look to press from out to in onto the centre-backs, but with the Netherlands ahead, they didn't even bother to press for the most part and would just position themselves to cover the passing lane. The reason for this is that the default shapes of both sides would mean there was often a 2 versus 1 against Dumfries in these positions. So if Gakpo, for example, was defending more traditionally and Robinson was able to get on the ball, Dumfries would then have to press him, and this would mean that Timber would potentially be dragged out of position. And this actually did happen on a few occasions where Gakpo was bypassed. But the goal of having the forward looking to cut off this route would mean that his cover shadow would cover the fullback, allowing Dumfries to be the man to defend the wider man, thus keeping Timber in a safer central position. So these are the positions that Depay and Gakpo take up, looking to make this pass as hard as possible, as they're in good positions to try and spring out to cut off the pass. And throughout the 90, both fullbacks for the US were quite aggressive, so in situations where they did get onto the ball, they would be quick to push high up, often joined by a pivot, to look to make the most of this wide overload, usually looking to instigate some third man runs, either from the fullback, or if the winger was the man who was central, the USA's attacking midfielders, in Musa, McKennie and Adams, who are all quite flexible, could also be the ones to make the runs in behind. And here we have an example of just that. As throughout the 90, both Robinson and Dest were willing to invert at times, so you can see that potential for this pass is on. And this means that both of the wingbacks in Blind as well as Dumfries off screen were more likely to be pushed high up the pitch. So now Dumfries has been moved out of position, so the USA can then look to instigate the switch. And now Musa has possession in a 1 versus 1 situation out wide, as he's rotated with Pulisic. And another example where Robinson is able to receive outside Gakpo, which then allows him to push higher. This now means that the US have a mini overload out wide, and the backline is being dragged across. So now with Dumfries worrying about Pulisic and Timber on McKennie, Robinson can make the third man run, but the return ball is just too heavy. But defensively, the Dutch were particularly effective at controlling the center of the pitch. This is because if the forwards did manage to cover the passing lane into the fullback, it left the centre-backs with plenty of space, however neither is good enough to be the playmaker from that deep. So the ball would get stuck in these deeper regions. This was also aided by the Dutch midfield going man-to-man, and Klaassen initially would almost man-mark Adams as he is crucial in the deepest phase, and if Musa looked to drop deep to be the second pivot, De Jong could follow, and the same with McKennie. So there were very limited passing options central. So part of the reason we did at times see the central midfielders looking to rotate with the fullback was to get a little more room to receive. However, it was fairly ineffective. In these man-to-man situations, if a team is defending in a more traditional manner and sitting off, it is up to the centre-backs to drive up the pitch, and this will usually then draw a midfielder, creating angles for the ball to then be progressed. However, the defensive shape of the Dutch would funnel the US through the centre of the pitch, so the centre-backs could only drive forward centrally, and it would be fairly easy for Klaassen to then step up to press them and still use his cover shadow to cover the midfielder, whilst everyone else was man-to-man. And Berhalter did look to adapt during this match, and we did at times see him willing to drop the forward, usually Ferreira, into the midfield to try and create somewhat of a 4 versus 3. However, the Dutch had a back 3, so they were more confident in looking to push up a centre-back to cover. But this wasn't always perfect, and there were opportunities for the US, as this would leave a gaping hole in the defence, and the front two, as well as midfield runners like Musa, could then look to break into that region. However, they didn't have the passing quality to make the most of these small windows of opportunity. So in this situation, both Pulisic and Reina have dropped deep, and this now draws Timber and Van Dijk out of position in the back line, and Musa is already looking to make the run into the space created. So now when the ball does go wide, there's the potential from the pass to Robertson to find Musa. However, it's just too heavy, and De Jong was making a great covering run. Otherwise, the back 3 of the Netherlands would have been fairly poorly positioned. Recognizing that danger, we did see the Dutch centre-backs hesitant to follow deep at times, meaning that the forwards, especially Pulisic, after Wright had come on, could receive in the midfield much more, and look to turn and run at the backline. But in this game, it led to nothing. The Netherlands had less possession, but they were effective with it. So what exactly did they look to do? Their first opportunities came in transition because, as discussed, both of the US fullbacks were quite aggressive when they had the ball. So now when there was a turnover, there were massive gaps in behind that Depay or Gakpo, as well as Dumfries, who was highly attacking, could look to exploit on that transition. And this is a perfect example of just that. The US had been attacking, so both Robinson and Dest are quite high up the pitch, looking to support. But on the transition, Depay is able to get onto the ball, and the centre-back is now way out of position, leading to Depay exploiting all the space behind the fullback, while we also see Dumfries unmarked looking to arrive at the back post. But when the Dutch were in controlled possession, initially the US pressed with a flatter front 3, with the midfield also looking to go man-to-man, much like the Netherlands did when they were in possession. But the Netherlands had a lot of weapons in their arsenal in order to deal with this. In Gakpo and Depay, the Netherlands had 2 forwards who are perfectly comfortable dropping into the midfield region to operate more as traditional midfielders, and this would mean that they would often have a 4 versus 3, and therefore would more likely be found with penetrative passes. The difference is where the Dutch had a back 3 and could afford to commit an extra man into the press, with the US only having a 2, committing a centre-back this high and leaving this gap was quite risky. The press shape from the US did end up adapting slightly, mainly switching to a front 2 of Pulisic and Ferreira, with Weah operating slightly deeper, looking to cover a passing lane into the midfield, meaning that the rest of the midfield could sit off slightly and look to potentially cover a forward when he dropped deep. But it wasn't just the centre that allowed the Dutch to thrive throughout this match, as they were also dangerous in the wide regions. Whether the US were pressing with a modified 2, or the flatter front 3, they had problems in the wide regions, as when Pulisic was central, for example, it could lead to Dumfries receiving the ball, and this would be the trigger for Gakpo to immediately move wide. So now Robinson had a problem, as he had 2 men to deal with, and a pivot would also always be keen to join, to help them create a wider overload. And Dumfries was aggressive with and without the ball, so he could then look to make the run down the outside to look to create opportunities by taking advantage of Robinson's positioning. And we see some of this in the first goal. The US are defending in a flatter front 3, allowing each of the forwards to pick up a centre-back. But this now means that when Blind gets on the ball, Dest is drawn high up the pitch and is way out of position. And as discussed, their forwards were willing to drop deeper, so Depay creates the extra option to receive in this situation. So after exchanging a 1-2 with Klaassen, it means that Depay now has space to find Gakpo. Dumfries was then willing to exploit the width, and eventually crosses the ball in for Depay. But the Dutch also took advantage of the narrow US front 3 in other ways high up the pitch. Because they were more concerned with pressing the centre-backs rather than dropping into a 4-5-1 for example, it meant that oftentimes the wing-backs would be free to push high up the pitch, and Dumfries in particular tended to start high up, whilst Blind could be the one to initially receive the ball deeper and initiate that overload. With Klaassen also looking to push high up into the front line, it would mean that the Dutch often had a 5 versus 4 advantage against the backline. So when they would get higher up the pitch and the backline had to shift across in order to cover, it would mean that the wingback, whether Dumfries here or Blind, if the situation was reversed, would be free to receive the ball, either directly or by playing passes through the midfield. And this leads to the second and third goals. So the Dutch are using a front five here, meaning that Dumfries has acres of space. So as the forwards are all between two men, Robinson's eyes are on the forward, meaning that Dumfries then gets on the end of the cross, leading to the third goal. Overall, the Netherlands were the deserved winners and put on a clinic when it comes to controlling the ball out of possession. The USA huffed and puffed, and particularly in the second half, had some promising moments that they can be proud of. For the managerial tactical scores, Van Gaal rolled back the years with a masterful tactical plan, meaning he earns an 8, whilst Berhalter's adjustments were also effective at times, earning him a respectable 6. But drop your ratings down below.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might enjoy the content available on my Patreon. Not only does Patreon help to support the continued production of content, as I am a one-man team, but it also gives you early access to videos that will come on the channel. You'll also get exclusive videos, get to vote on polls, and so much more. And it's cheaper than ever, no longer having a tier system, so everyone on the Patreon gets access to all the content. So head over to patreon.com/footballmadesimple to check it out.
And a special thanks to my latest patrons, Justin Robinson, 1T, Bagat, Konstantinos, and Cesar.
But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.